It's great to be joined today by Rick Wilson, who is a seasoned Republican strategist, also author of the best-selling book, Everything Trump Touches Dies, which is releasing in paperback with new material. Rick, really a pleasure having you on.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
So for my audience, which is overwhelmingly left-wing,
Sure.
they may not know your background in being both a Republican strategist, but someone who is not a supporter of Donald Trump. So merely to sort of get everybody up to speed on you, what is it about your values and political views that did not allow you to support Donald Trump?
Well, I'm not a fan of authoritarianism, statism, crony capitalism, government directed to, as a profit center for an individual family, or frankly, the appearance in American political life of what is essentially a royal family. Set aside from the fact that Donald Trump is also a moral vacuum and a terrible human being, a bad businessman, a bad leader, a bad negotiator, and a bad just about everything. And deeply compromised by his own personal weaknesses. This whole combination of factors led me to the point where I could not, as a principled, limited government conservative, stand up and support this guy.
Why do you believe it is that he maintains such a high level of support among Republicans?
Well, we've right now got a country that's very much divided into two media and political silos. And Republicans have basically abandoned all the things that they used to be about in terms of conservative principles, which is to say constitutional fealty, limited government, individual liberty. And basically they have entered into what I call entertainment republicanism, where they like the show, they like the spectacle, they like Trump owning the libs, they like the hissy fits and the anger and the stompy feet. And they like the screamy Twitter feed and the rage tweeting. And they've replaced conservatism with that.
Are there things that Donald Trump has either proposed or accomplished that you are pleased with?
Not particularly, because I look at the policy direction of the administration. They always point to regulatory reform, regulatory rollback. Well, look, does the government regulate too much and in too many areas? Absolutely. But what they did with this administration was they got a laundry list from donors who literally gave them a shopping list with money and said, do these things for us. That's not deregulation in the way that I think we ought to look at reducing the regulatory overlay in this country. That's just pure crony capitalism. So I'm not really a fan of any of the policy directions. He really hasn't accomplished a whole lot else in terms of the administration. He kind of picked up the ball and signed it on criminal justice reform, but that has been something that that folks like me in the Right on Crime movement have been working on for 15 years to try to reduce mandatory minimum sentences and to reduce sentences that disproportionately affect African American and other voters.
Are there any either executive orders, policy reforms, anything that Donald Trump has done that you see as sort of left-wing accomplishments, aside from whether you as a
Sure.
conservative like them, just whether you see something that sounds to you more like a left-winger than a right-winger?
Sure. Look, this is a president who very much believes in expanding the power of the executive, expanding the power of the government. And I think that it's ironic that a lot of people who were quote unquote Tea Party conservatives are now cheerleading when Donald Trump, expands the size of the government by adding, wants to add 100,000 officers to ICE and Border Patrol, wants to use the power of the Oval Office to manipulate businesses and where they can build factories or where they can't. Wants to use the power of the presidency to start a trade war, which I think is a fundamentally unconservative economic decision. So there are a lot of things that it's not even progressive. It's more along the lines of statism, and that's where I think Donald Trump is very comfortable in that statist space.
Do you see the use of the national emergency as an example of the sort of expansion of executive power to get around the will of the House and Senate?
Absolutely, the emergency declaration was something that if Obama had done it in the same scope, which is to say, doing something in direct contravention of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which is to say the Congress is the control source of the money. They appropriate the money. It must be spent for the things they appropriate that money on. If Barack Obama had done that, Republicans would be outside the White House with pitchforks and torches. And so this emergency order is definitely a way for Trump to attempt to expand and very dramatically expand the scope of executive power. And I object to that, not only as a constitutionalist, but as a conservative.
I want to get your sense on whether there is something unique about the fact that most Republicans are continuing to support Trump or not. And I'll frame it up in this particular way. Moral psychologists like Jonathan
Sure.
Haidt, for example, in The Rational Mind, have talked about sometimes it seems as though individual voters are voting against their own best interests or their stated values. So you gave the Tea Party conservatives voting for expansions of government as an example.
Sure.
What Haidt argues is that we're looking at the wrong sort of zoom level, that we shouldn't be analyzing their actions on the basis of their personal priorities or stated goals, but rather how they perceive it as being part of the group priorities of the group they identify with. Is it as simple as that? Is it as simple as Republicans nominated this guy, I'm a Republican, so I support him?
Well, it's also a matter that there is an entire media infrastructure now on the far right and the Trump right that has been very malleable in its ideological groundings. So Fox, the largest television station or network in the nation, reaches 90 million households. It is overwhelmingly watched by Republicans. They are the agenda-setting feature of the media landscape on the Trump right. And because they've been so malleable, because they've reduced this now to pure tribalism and not to ideological points or ideological policy questions, you've got them very much reflexively in defense of Trump, because to not defend Trump in their minds now, according to the Fox Nation, is to lose to the libs, is to give in to progressive, socialist, communist, Antifa, whatever fantasy version of the left that's in their heads at that moment. So that it's both the tribalism and the media reinforcement mechanism that together combine to be a very powerful influence on the way the right's ideological homogeneity has developed around Trump.
What do you think is the long-term impact of this presidency? In other words, is it going to open up the door to sort of a permanent coarsening of political discourse and the sort of irrelevance of political positions? Is this going to kind of rebound back for the Republican Party?
Look, I think look, we already saw that 40 Republicans lost their seats in the 2018 election because they ran content-free campaigns based on Donald Trump. It was a referendum on, do you love the dear leader or do you not love the dear leader? Most people do not love the dear leader. 65 to 70% of the people in this country do not love the dear leader. So the Republican Party rebranding itself as a Trump party, solely as a party dedicated to and driven by Donald Trump, in that regard, they have abandoned all the ideological infrastructure that would allow them to walk back and say, let's take a deep breath. Let's sit around a table. Let's negotiate an issue. Let's talk something through. And look, both parties have forces within them that are driving that, edges out dialogue style, because it's now, to put the shoe on the other foot. On the left, it's like, no, you can't even question AOC and the Green New Deal. You can't even ask a question about it because suddenly you're violating all of your loyalty to the progressive cause. You can't even say, is this a thoroughly thought out plan if you're on the left? You can't do that because there's a similar set of behaviors in both tribes to talk out to the edges and not into the center.
Yeah, I've experienced that. I mean, just pointing out that there have been just flat out missteps on economic policy from AOC. Sure. I was no longer sort of part of the in crowd that was saying this is the future and everything about this is great. I'm curious. So in 2016, there were some on the left, I was not one of them, who were of the mindset that Hillary was the wrong direction for the Democratic Party. So who cares if it's Trump, because we want to tear it all down to at some point in the future build it back up. That wasn't my politics. I'm curious where you are in terms of, do you want to see a primary challenge to Trump? Do you want to see a Democrat win in 2020? What is your path forward?
I'd love to see a primary challenge to Trump. I'd love to see a principled, small government, legitimate conservative who could mount a serious and meaningful effort against Donald Trump. Is that person out there right now? Not yet.
It's not Bill Weld, it sounds like you're saying.
I like Bill. Okay, I do. I like Bill. He's affable. He's eccentric. I kind of love those things about him.
Yeah.
But I don't know that Bill Weld mounts a credible national campaign against Donald Trump. And is able to rally a meaningful fraction of conservatives to say, okay, let's reboot from one eccentric to another eccentric. And like I said, I would love to see that. I don't know where that hypothetical, person is or who that is. And I know these guys pretty well. I'm kind of an expert on these people. And the other option, of course, is some sort of principled centrist independent candidate. And you've got a Howard Schultz out there right now, but it looks like he's having a rough start. But we'll see where that goes. You may end up with other independents in the race. You may end up with other center right or center left people in the race. And the Democratic primary field may end up having a very, very, very crowded progressive lane on the far left, where you've got the Bernies and the Warrens and the Kamala Harrises, and a less crowded lane in the center left of the Klobuchars and maybe the Bidens of the world. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So, look, I think Donald Trump is a disaster for this country politically, morally, and in every other dimension. Sorry, the crows in my pond are squawking. Maybe it's a sign.
Yeah.
But I think Trump is a disaster on almost every axis. But look, I also know one thing about the Democratic Party, and guys like me beat Democrats across this country for years and years and years. Since 2008, we took 1,100 seats from the Democrats. So we won about 300 back in 18, nationally speaking. But we took about 1,100 seats because the Democrats as a party are not holistically good at politics. They are good at elements of politics. They're good at the casting element. They get a Barack Obama, a Bill Clinton. They find a real talent once in a while. They're not as good at the operational elements of politics. They're not as good at the nuts and bolts of politics, and they're really not as good at speaking American, because they convince themselves that the policies they want to talk about are the ones that voters really care about, and they rarely are.
Yeah,
and the Democrats are going to want to lead this election with climate change, gun control, and third-term abortion. You know where voters put those things on their lists of most important issues?
Quite low.
In the single digits.
Yeah.
They care about the economy. They care about jobs. They care about their personal financial situation. They care about their kids. They care about education. They care about a country and a government that feels disconnected and arrogant and distant. And for folks on the left, that's not just the Trump administration. They feel that way all the time, D or R. There's a great collapse in our country of trust in the institution of government and trust in the institution of Congress. No matter which party's in control, it tends to not be something that voters repose much trust in. And so I think there are more important ways to go after Trump and to go after the national election. But Democrats, as I like to joke, they seek political death at all times.
Very similar to the criticisms I've had, unfortunately, of the Democratic Party for years. Hey, I know you've got to run, Rick, but one thing I wanted to ask you about, in preparation for the interview, I read an article, and some of them are mixing together. It's from last year, and it says that you're either now regularly carrying a gun and you didn't previously, or you're regularly open carrying when maybe before you were carrying.
No, I concealed carry. Florida is a concealed carry state, not an open carry state. I concealed carry because we have had 2.5 years of death threats against me, my wife, my kids, my dogs. We've had plenty of people up at the house. We've had plenty of people in public, who get very aggro and very in my face. And there's been a lot of harassment and swatting that's gone on. We've had the violent threats against, like I said, every member of my family. And so I concealed carry. I'm highly trained. I put a lot of rounds down range in practice. I'm very safety conscious about it. I don't treat it lightly or frivolously. It's not some sort of far right wing macho guy talk.
My question was going to be whether that was specifically because of your anti-Trump position publicly. It is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
All right. Please check out
not always
Rick's
fun,
book.
but it is what it is.
It is what it is. That's for sure. And you outline a lot of it in the book, Everything Trump Touches Dies, which is releasing in paperback with new material. Rick, I really appreciate your time today.
Absolutely, David. Thanks for having me.